Hi everyone, my name is Jenny Aker. I'm an Associate Professor of Development Economics at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. And the purpose of this very short presentation is to summarize some research that my colleagues and I did looking at the impact of a mobile money cash transfer program in Niger. So the overall motivation for this study was the fact that over the course of the past 20 or 30 years, cash transfers have played an increasingly important role in social protection programs in many countries. In 2013, it was estimated that about 119 cash transfer programs were in place throughout the world. And while we know a lot about the impact of these programs on development outcomes, the cost of these programs is much less discussed. Now, that's kind of a non-trivial concern because if you think about what this actually means, these can result in security, logistical, and transport challenges, especially in countries that have very few formal financial institutions, because it means getting small denominations of cash out to remote rural areas. This is more than a theoretical concern as well, because this can imply very high costs for the implementing agency, which can affect cost effectiveness, and it can also add on additional costs and burdens to the program recipients themselves, many of whom are already quite poor and vulnerable. So what this study looks at is the case of Niger, a landlocked country in sub-Saharan Africa and one of the poorest countries in the world. And in 2009, Niger experienced a very severe drought. By early 2010, about half of the population was experiencing food shortages. And the way in which governments and NGOs responded to this crisis was by implementing a cash transfer program to help households really cope. Now, you would think that this would actually be pretty straightforward. There wasn't necessarily a large-scale conflict at the time. There were no earthquakes or floods. And while there were some skirmishes along the way, it's important to remember that Niger is a very vast country. There are very few paved roads. There's one bank for every 100,000 people. And so what a cash transfer program typically meant was that it required going to the bank, getting cash in small denominations into individual envelopes, then transporting it out to remote rural areas like this, and ensuring that it wasn't stolen along the way, which often meant hiring security. And that meant very substantial costs to the implementing agencies. So in early 2010, before kind of many of these cash transfer programs were actually implemented, mobile money was introduced into Niger. And like its counterparts in the Philippines and Kenya, it enabled individuals to transfer money back and forth just simply using a mobile phone and through a system of agents. It didn't require having a bank account. What that also meant is that it gave the government and NGOs the potential to use mobile money as a way to actually implement or distribute these cash transfers. And that was really the focus of this research, was basically to say, if these cash transfers are distributed electronically using the mobile money system as compared to the normal way of doing things, which is manual cash, what did this mean for the actual costs, both to the implementing agency and to the program recipients themselves, and were there any additional benefits to this? We did this in the context of a randomized controlled trial in Niger, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that meant. So what did these cash transfer interventions actually look like at the time? Well, it was implemented by Concern Worldwide, an Irish NGO, in response to this food crisis. It was a significant cash transfer, about $225 over a 5-month period. And the targeting happened where villages that were hit by the drought were primarily targeted. Within villages, the poorest households were targeted. And within the household, the primary female was targeted. So the wife, or if there were multiple wives, it was the first wife. So what did this research design actually look like? Well, as I said previously, all of the households or all the villages were affected by drought. They were all equally eligible for either receiving an electronic transfer or a manual cash transfer. So they were randomly assigned to one of 3 interventions. The first one was just the normal way of doing things that I described previously, where there was a manual cash transfer that took place either in your village or a nearby village. The second one was that you got the exact same thing as the first. It was manual cash, but you also got a mobile phone, and that mobile phone was enabled with a mobile money account, at the time called Zap. The third one was exactly the same as the second one. You got a mobile phone, but rather than getting that cash transfer manually, you got it electronically via the mobile money account. And all of these cash transfers took place at the same time, so the timing was quite similar. Now, why do we have to distribute mobile phones? Well, we had to distribute mobile phones because basically mobile money was recently introduced into Niger, and so a lot of people didn't necessarily have access to mobile phones. So this was really important for the success of that program. And so by comparing these 3 different types of interventions, we're able to say something about different types of interventions. So we didn't have a peer control group. As I said, everyone was quite poor, but by comparing the group that got the mobile phone and manual cash with the group that just got the manual cash, we're able to see whether or not there's any additional impact of a mobile phone that might just be positive from distributing a mobile phone without changing the delivery mechanism. And by comparing the two groups that got a mobile phone, one of them got their cash transfer electronically, the other one manually. This allows us to see whether or not there's any additional impacts from getting this cash transfer in an electronic way. So as I said previously, mobile money was quite new in Niger. About 30% of households owned a mobile phone, so that's why mobile phones were distributed to these two groups. In addition, there weren't necessarily very many agents, so Concern spent a bunch of time working with the mobile phone operator at the time, ensuring there were agents at this area. And third, a lot of people weren't necessarily very familiar with mobile money, and so there was a large-scale sensitization program, and you see some of the examples of that sensitization program here, explaining how mobile money actually worked and how it was going to work in the context of this cash transfer program. So what were the things that we were looking at? Well, as I said previously, it was costs and benefits. Benefits in terms of food security, nutrition, assets, and if we saw any benefits, really trying to explain what might explain these differences between the three groups. So on the cost side, this shows the cost to the implementing agency Concern worldwide over time. Blue is the ZAP group and green is the manual cash transfer group. And what you see is that at the very beginning, there were kind of quite large fixed costs to setting up this mobile money cash transfer program. That's for the reasons that I previously discussed, doing a sensitization campaign, distributing mobile phones, working with the mobile phone operator. But over time, we saw that the variable costs, the monthly costs of implementing the cash transfer program were much cheaper in the ZAP group as compared to the manual cash transfer group. Now, what did this mean in terms of the program recipients and them picking up their cash transfer? If we look at the manual cash group, they were spending kind of about 2 kilometers just one way to go and pick up their cash transfer. So 4 kilometers round trip, that's about an hour's walk. That excludes wait time, which was quite significant in some villages because you had to all go at the same time and pick up your cash transfer. That's compared to about half a kilometer in the ZAP group because they could go to any agent whenever they wanted to, so didn't necessarily need to go at the time when everyone else was going. And that significantly reduced not only their kind of travel time, but also their wait time as well. And this is really important during a time of the year where people were really time constrained because it was the agricultural season. Now, what did that mean in terms of other types of impacts? And we looked at several different things. First one was basically purchasing behavior. So what you see here along the x-axis is different types of categories of food and non-food items that people used their cash transfer on. You see that pretty much everyone used it to buy staple grains, but there were some important differences between the ZAP group, the mobile money group, and the manual cash transfer group. What were those differences? Well, the ZAP households were more likely to buy other types of foodstuffs, cowpeas, which are black-eyed peas, meat, condiments, and oil. There are statistically significant differences for these, and these are basically kind of richer in proteins and fats. So this is kind of an interesting finding in terms of why they actually changed their purchases. Now, did these differences in purchases result in any differences in other indicators like food security? Well, this shows different categories for the Household Diet Diversity Index, where we asked households what they actually consumed over the past 24 hours. We saw that there were no differences, again, in the consumption of grains, which is not so surprising since everyone bought grains. But the ZAP households were more likely to consume certain food groups, and they had overall household diet diversity that was about 8 to 16% higher as compared to the manual cash households. And many of these differences in consumption map to the differences in purchasing patterns that we saw on the previous slide. So why would the simple act of getting your cash transfer electronically matter? Why would we see any differences in purchases and any differences in terms of household food security? Well, we had a number of hypotheses going into this in terms of the mechanism. I'm not going to go through all of these here, but we basically kind of provide suggestive evidence of 2 of them. And the first one is these reduced costs of obtaining the transfer, which I mentioned for the ZAP household was much less. This is during a time of year when people were quite busy, so this freed up their time to do other things. The second one was it seemed to really kind of change the way in which decisions were made within the household with respect to the uses of the cash transfer. And what do I mean by that? In the manual cash villages, what we were told is that the program recipient went to pick up the cash, which was normal, but also went with other household members, often cases perhaps her spouse or another male household member like her son. And this was in a context in Niger where it's not very traditional that women, either individually or in groups, would travel to markets by themselves to use the cash transfer to spend it on a variety of different things. And so what they reported is that as soon as they actually received the cash transfer, they would often hand it over to another member of their household, often the male member of their household, and that left them with very little time to discuss how they wanted to prioritize and use this cash transfer. Now, that's different from the Zap households where, as I said previously, they received a mobile phone. Many of the women wore this around their neck as a necklace so they could hear the moment that the beep came in, telling them that their cash transfer had arrived. If they were working out in an agricultural field, they weren't going to necessarily come home right away. They were going to wait until the evening and report back that the cash transfer had been received. And what they reported was that by doing that in the evening in the privacy of their own home, it really allowed them the time to discuss with their other family members what they wanted to use that purchase on. And what many of the women reported is that they wanted it to be used on things that weren't necessarily always traditionally bought, kind of these richer foodstuffs like black-eyed peas, fats, other types of things. So what was the summary of the findings? Again, mobile money being used for a cash transfer program in this context decreased the costs for the implementing agency, for actually distributing all of these cash transfers, and also reduced the cost for the program recipients. But there were very large fixed costs to getting this started, which might be different in different contexts that have a more extensive mobile money system. Secondly, that there were these benefits beyond the simple cost reduction, which were related to diversity of purchases and diversity of food security. And third, that basically we saw this not only because of the reduction to picking up your cash transfer, because it also seemed to change slightly the way in which intra-household decisions were made with respect to this transfer. Now, what does this mean for policy, given the fact that there's a lot of interest in using mobile money and digital financial services for kind of pushing payments? Now, we have some evidence of the impact of mobile money in Kenya and Rwanda, as well as like biometric transfers in India. I would argue that this is a fraction of what we really need to know in order to kind of build this up in this space. Obviously, the necessary infrastructure needs to be in place, both on the supply side in terms of the agents and the platform, and on the demand side. We need to be thinking a lot about, do people understand it? Is it costly for them? Do they have their own mobile phones? What are the normal ways in which people usually get access to money? Obviously, payments could also potentially push take-up of mobile money to be used for other things. But the question is, will people actually continue to use mobile money after the cash transfers end? There are a lot of examples of bank accounts being opened in Peru and in India in order to support a lot of different cash transfer programs, and those accounts aren't necessarily used after the program is finished. And finally, we need to think a little bit more about the fact that while mobile money can potentially promote financial inclusion by getting people using mobile financial services, it's not necessarily going to bank the unbanked, thinking about the fact that financial inclusion not just is payments, but also savings, credit, insurance, and other types of schemes. And so we need to be thinking about those things as we're thinking about the potential of mobile money to promote financial inclusion. So thanks so much for listening. I hope that this was useful. If you want to read the paper in more detail, it's available on my website. It's also available in the journal. And feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Thanks so much.